how all three are related to each other today. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to focus now what's the relationship between language, oral language and written language, and the implications for learning to read. And then we're going to look at what's the relationship between literacy and thinking. What is special about literacy? Why is it worth considering? Why is it worth our while, so to speak? So the first thing that's come up is a debate that goes back and forth. Right now we're not in the midst of this big heated debate, but it's a debate that comes back in cyclical cycles. Notice how cycles are cyclical? So I love it when I notice I do something kind of silly like that. But the great debate that we talk about is learning to read the same as learning to speak? Is learning to read basically learning language by vision? Is that the same process that's involved in learning to speak, which is oral? And there are some people who say yes. And the most commonly known proponents for that would include the whole language people like Kane Goodman and Frank Smith. And what they argue is that language is for comprehension. The goal of reading is comprehension. And so a lot of the comprehension processes that are involved doesn't matter if it's visual or if it's oral. And so what they say is that the best way for kids to learn to read is by immersing them in a print-rich environment. So how many of you have seen in preschools and in kindergarten classrooms where everything's labeled? So you see desk with desk, chair, chair, door with the door on it. So what they would argue, this reflects sort of the whole language viewpoint, that kids will learn to read pretty naturally if learning to read is something that's meaningful. You want to expose kids to good literature, and if it's meaningful and interesting and engaging, then they're going to pick up how to learn to read. In contrast, there are other people who say no. Learning to read is something that's very different than learning to speak. Some of the arguments that they'll say is that, well, oral language, speech, that's something that's universal, cross-cultural. But written language, it's not universal. It's been introduced relatively recently to human history. And not all cultures, increasingly they are, but not all cultures have always been literate. There's a history of literacy. And so what they would argue is that what kids need is direct instruction and how to figure out how those words on the page relate to oral language. So while they'll say that comprehension is really important, figuring out those words on the page, learning to decode, is something that's not natural, that's really unnatural. When kids are listening to language, when you're listening to language, are you paying attention to the individual sounds, or are you paying attention to the meaning? Are you thinking, wow, her words, the word word, have you ever had that experience thinking about like a particular word and how it sounds? Word, 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 and loses all its meaning? It kind of arrests all sort of comprehension, and it's not a very natural thing to do. So people who are in favor of direct instruction would say that learning to read is not natural, that we need to teach kids how to decode. And what they would say is that kids need systematic and explicit instruction. We need to teach kids how to sound out words. We need kids to hear the individual sounds in words. Teach them how to figure out what the words are. That basically learning to read is basically figuring out this code. It's, how many of you have done those word search word games where you have each letter is represented by a different number and you have to crack the code to figure out what the words are? Well, essentially what they're saying is that learning to read is very similar to that, except instead of connecting the letters to numbers, what you're doing is you're connecting letters to sounds. And once you sound out the words like cat, k, at, and blend them together to go cat, then you can figure out what the word is and it's meaningful. And what they say is that Okay, a lot of kids can figure it out by themselves, but even more kids benefit when they're taught the code. Why have them have that extra step of trying to crack the code when you can teach them the code? And currently what we find in instruction, in the 90s there was a really bad debate, like the great debate in the 90s. It was really damaging to education because it made it look like educators didn't know what we were talking about. And often it wasn't the researchers that were fueling the flames. It was people who said, oh yeah, whole language sounds really reasonable. And I was in schools. I went into schools in the 90s where school teachers were not allowed to hang up the letters of the alphabet in kindergarten, first grade, second grade classrooms because they said, nope, it's out of context, it's not meaningful. And I'd be in these schools where there were some teachers who were really good at sneaking in teaching the letters of the alphabet. Have you noticed that in a lot of schools, the classroom door is closed? And then when there's a visitor in the classroom, the door is open all the way and you can't see what's on the back of the door? Well, some of the teachers will put the letters of the alphabet on the door, so when the principal would come to inspect, they just stand with the door pressed all the way closed so that the teacher can't see the letters hanging there. But at least the kids were able to see it. And so some people would say, oh, well, all you want to do is get the kids to sound out words. You're not focusing on meaning. And what people like Marilyn Adams and Jean Chall and Catherine Snow argue is that, no, teaching the kids how to sound out the words is something that's necessary if you can't figure out what the words on the page are, you can't understand the meaning. But please don't stop just with sounding out the words. I can teach all of you how to decode in Yiddish. I'll bet that just being able to read a passage in Yiddish doesn't mean you'll be able to understand it. So you need to be able to have both the meaning and as well the decoding. And so right now, fortunately, education is in a much better place in looking at what we call balanced instruction. And so the standards all say that learning to decode is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We have to build vocabulary. We have to build comprehension. We have to make reading meaningful to kids from the start. But in order for it to be meaningful, we also have to teach them how to figure out what those squiggles on the page mean, what the sounds are, how they relate to words. So here are some skills that kids need to learn. One of the first skills is learning text or story structures. So when we think of stories for kids, what's one of the most common phrases with fairy tales for children and young stories for children? Once upon a time. So that's a very common story structure. And how do we end many stories for young children? The end. And they lived happily ever after, or just plain the end. And you'll actually find that come up in children's writing. In kindergarten, in first grade, when they start telling stories, they'll start with once upon a time, they'll have something that's kind of rambly, and then it ends with the end, and that's how you know it's over. So kids learn certain things about story structures. And a thing to keep in mind is that the text structures that we expect kids to use is culturally dependent. Different cultures have different text structures. They have different story structures. So some cultures have more recursive stories. So it sounds like you're talking about many different things, but then it all comes together at the end. So an example would be telling a story about having an Oreo or some sort of store-bought cookie and getting sick. And then you have some store-bought muffins and you get sick. And then you have store-bought cake and you get sick. And then you have grandma's home cooking and everything's fine. And it all goes along with the theme of, wow, the home cooking is best. That's not a traditional Western European approach to storytelling. And some kids who use that storytelling structure in sharing time in kindergarten, what often happens is they're sharing time, they're supposed to talk about one thing, and then they start doing, they had the cookies and they got sick. What does the teacher assume? Once they say, I had these store-bought cookies and then I got sick. if you're expecting traditional Western storytelling structure, what does the teacher assume? Story's over. And then when the child starts saying, and then I went to my aunt's and I had these store-bought muffins and I got sick. At that point, the teacher's like, you already told your story, sit down, you're over, story time's over. And what's really happening is that the teacher's not recognizing that the child's using a different text structure. So it's important to keep in mind that text structures and story structures, those are things that are really important for children to understand stories and to be successful in storytelling. And that the cultural influences play a huge role. How many of you have read Agatha Christie books? I used to read them a lot. And then after reading about 5 of them, I stopped reading them because I figured out that I could do the shortcut. Read the first chapter and find out all the characters in the setting, and then read the last chapter and get the entire plot. I learned the structure for Agatha Christie books. So different stories have different genres. Different genres have different text structures. Mysteries have particular text structures. Those teeny bopper romance stories, Sweet Valley High, those stories, they all have the same sort of structure. You read one, they all seem the same. But to a child just encountering them, they're all new and exciting. Learning about text structures is really helpful for comprehension because it helps you predict what's going to happen. Vocabulary and general knowledge is really important for reading comprehension and language comprehension. Why is vocabulary important? How is vocabulary important for reading comprehension and literacy? Yep.
Is it to relate to whatever they're going through to tell adults what's on their mind and stuff?
Yep, so that having a big, broad, diverse, rich vocabulary helps with their communication. And you'll find that children's writing scores on the CASI and the 4th grade writing assessment, and for the SAT, the writing part for the SAT, you'll find that vocabulary is a huge predictor of what people's scores are on there. That the children who use more advanced vocabulary, richer vocabulary, broader vocabulary, tend to be more successful at expressing themselves in writing. They also understand a lot more. How many of you have taken a course where you didn't understand the vocabulary in that area? It's a new thing and everything sounded foreign to you, even though it was supposedly in English? It was all jargon? How many of you have had that experience? And then once you found you understood the jargon and the vocabulary, it's like, oh, okay, this makes sense. This is cool. And that vocabulary and jargon becomes sort of a shorthand for understanding the themes. So having this background knowledge, the broader the background knowledge you have, the broader the vocabulary you have, the more you'll be able to get out of what you read. So those are critical for reading comprehension. Another thing that's important, especially for young children, is print awareness. So kids have to recognize that print is something special, something different, that there's a message to it. So that, for example, seeing that big golden arches, the big M, that's meaningful for something. And that when you become parents, a child might see those golden arches. They're not reading yet, but they recognize that logo, and they're like, Happy Meal, Happy Meal, Happy Meal, I want a Happy Meal. But in order for print awareness is more than just recognizing logos. It's recognizing how books work. So recognizing that you open them, you turn the pages. If you're reading English, then you go from left to right, the way that you track. For other languages, you might be going from right to left instead of left to right, or top to bottom. Recognizing that there's a message to them. When I was in China, and I was observing a class that was reading together, a 3rd grade class, and it was choral reading. I don't read Chinese, but there was one kid there that I knew wasn't reading. He was just sort of mumbling what everyone else was saying, and that was because I could see his finger jumping all over the page pretty randomly. while all the other kids, they were tracking the characters in a systematic way. So print awareness is understanding how to track, understanding, recognizing the letters, being aware of the letters, knowing how books open. I've been in kindergartens where I've seen kids not even know that you're supposed to open books. They haven't had that experience before. Now, of course, by the end of the year, they know how books work, but when they come in, they never saw them. And here's a term that you're going to learn, and we're going to spend a lot of time next week, and that's phonological awareness. And phonology is the sound structure of English, or any language. And phonological awareness is being explicitly aware of the sounds of language, being able to identify the sounds, being able to play with the sounds. So examples would be things like rhyming. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you... Gee, one of the things that helps kids figure out is that they become sensitive to rhymes when they're about 5 years old, 4 years old. They start being sensitive to rhymes. They start with rhyming games. Anna, Fana, Bobana, Bana. They don't get that until they start being aware of the individual sounds in language. Another thing that they also start becoming aware of is sort of, what's the first sound in a word? Breaking a word down. So what sound does cat start with? Not the letter, what sound? K. Yeah. So kids have to be able to hear the individual sounds of words. Here's an explanation, and Marilyn Adams, she did a great job explaining it, and so I've kind of stolen it from Marilyn Adams. But she said, okay, kids, you can teach them to sound out, you could sound out words. I teach them that C says K, A says A, T says T, for example. But a child who's not phonologically aware, to them, you might as well be teaching them that cats say meow, dogs say woof, cows say moo. So when they see the letters, it's like, okay, yeah, this is another one of those ridiculous things that grown-ups want us to memorize. And so what a teacher will do with a child who's not phonologically aware, the child will teach the child, okay, what sound does C make? K. Right, okay, and what sound does A make? Ah. And what sound does T make? T. Okay. And the child will do all of that, and it would never occur to that child who's not phonologically aware that those are the sounds of the word cat, that you could blend those sounds together and come up with a word. To them, it's like once they sound it out, okay, I'm done. I've got all of the sounds. So the child is frustrated because the child doesn't realize that there's a connection to language, doesn't recognize that the B in banana is similar to the sound in big, is similar to the same sound that starts in bird or boy or ball. They don't get it. Now, we now know that phonological awareness is something that can be taught, but basically, in order to crack the code to figure out how letters are related to sounds, you have to hear the individual sounds, and you have to recognize the letters before you could put them together successfully to make words. And we're going to talk a lot more about this as the course goes on. But these are some of the critical skills involved with children needing to learn to read. And what I've decided is I'm going to stop the discussion of how kids learn to read until we've talked more about the spelling structure of English, the sound structure of English, and wait until we have that background to really get into the theory of how kids learn to read, what are the stages of learning to read. And instead what we're going to do is look now at what are the cognitive benefits of learning to read. Does learning to read change the way that you think? And that comes in part from the Great Divide theories. Anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, cross-cultural psychologists initially said, you know, there are some really important cognitive differences between people who can read and people who are illiterate. And these differences are a direct response to being able to read. And part of the argument is saying that the skills involved in reading lead to different thinking styles. And different forms of communication can lend themselves well to other forms of thinking. So if you want to argue philosophy, smoke signals might not be the best way to develop these philosophical arguments. It takes too long to make each signal. They dissipate with time. It's not a good medium for building philosophical argumentation. And print lends itself well because of its relative permanence, the way that you can reflect back on it, that they would argue that literate societies, because of print, they're able to engage in kinds of thinking that they wouldn't be able to engage in as easily. And some of the people who made these arguments would be Greenfield. She argued that literacy is a prerequisite for logical thought. One of the examples, remember that example, an ox is a cucumber? Well, people thought that that would be an example of illogical thought, that was magical thinking, and that literacy, we need to have literacy for this logical, systematic thinking. Ong argued that literacy is something that fosters abstract thought. So you can talk about philosophical concepts. I think, therefore I am. The philosophers were all literate, great philosophers. And they argued that it's the vehicle of print that enabled them to think abstractly. Yeah. Here are some examples earlier on. So logical and analytic models of thought, general and abstract uses of language, critical and rational thought, a skeptical and questioning attitude, a distinction between myth and history, the recognition of the importance of time and space, complex and modern governments with separation of church and state, political democracy and great social equity, economic development, it leads to people who are innovative, achievement-oriented, productive, cosmopolitan, politically aware, more globally, nationally, and internationally oriented. So Jim G, in his argumentation of literacy, he would say that all these accomplishments are the result of being in a literate culture. It's not saying that everyone who is literate has these skills, but a literate culture is what fosters the ability to think these ways so that these accomplishments can be made. David Olson argued that logical development in a literature culture involves learning to apply logical operations to the sentence meaning rather than to the assimilated or interpreted or assumed speaker's meaning. Development consists of learning to confine interpretation to the meaning explicitly represented in the text and to draw inferences exclusively from that formal but restricted interpretation. The developmental hypothesis offered here is that the ability to assign a meaning to a sentence per se, independent of its linguistic interpretive context, is achieved only well into the school years. So again, there's the idea that literacy and building literacy fosters this kind of decontextualized logical thinking. Because the demands of literacy require you to do things. Yeah?
But I don't completely agree with that.
Uh-huh.
So, that would require literacy to come before advanced logical thought. But the way our society progressed all the way back would be, unless you take like a creator perspective, logical thought kind of led to writing. So not necessarily, how many times have you had a great idea and not written it down? Does that make it less of a great idea because you didn't write it down?
Uh-huh.
So all the great philosophers, yeah, they were literate, but I'm sure there were other people who were still thinking, that were there.
And
so,
there's no record?
Yeah. So, I think that the literacy helps advance the society and that people can learn more quickly these logical ideas and abstract thinking. But I don't see how the literacy kind of is required for this kind of abstract or logical thought.
Yeah, and you might also think in terms of, well, someone had to invent writing. And cuneiform was invented primarily as a bookkeeping sort of mechanism for traders over distances, as record keeping of what's delivered as well. So there's that abstract thought in the commerce that was leading the development of writing. So yeah, these are some of the theories that are known as the Great Divide theories. And actually, you're anticipating the next, well, a couple slides from now. So you're anticipating some of the arguments against the Great Divide theory. But I want to sort of lay the context so that you get that historical feel. But yeah, I love where you're coming from and thinking about that. I love that, yay. Okay, so what we've got here is we're going to look at one of the tasks that they used to argue for this, this idea of the Great Divide theories. And over here we have some syllogisms. When it rains, there are clouds. All clouds are in the sky. Therefore, when it rains, there are clouds in the sky. Is this a valid argument? Yes. And is this consistent with our experiences? Yeah. And what cultural anthropologists were initially finding, so people like Ong and Greenfield, when they were going to these cultures where they were non-literate, where there wasn't written system, then they would give people syllogisms. And some of the syllogisms would be things that are familiar to them. And those were relatively easy to solve. And then there were other syllogisms that they would give them that would be totally foreign to their experiences. Things like, all bears in the Arctic are polar bears. All polar bears are white. Therefore, all the bears in the Arctic are polar bears that are white. Is this a valid argument? All bears in the Arctic are polar bears. All polar bears are white. Therefore, all bears in the Arctic are polar bears that are white. It is a valid argument. It follows from the premises. But if you come from a culture that doesn't have the decontextualized thinking, that doesn't have the schooling that encourages this kind of thought, this is something that what Greenfield and Ong would find people say to this is, well, I haven't seen the polar bears. This isn't, I can't talk about things I don't know about. Only fools talk about things they don't know about. Why are you asking me this? Go ask someone else. They might have been to the Arctic. They might know, but don't ask me. And that led early theorists who developed the Great Divide theories to think, okay, there's something different, because when we go to the literate cultures, when we have, for example, American or Western European students do these types of problems, that we actually find that they're able to solve the ones that are unfamiliar to their backgrounds. And so they would argue that this is evidence that it's a reflection of logical thought. So that would be some of the evidence that they would use to support the Great Divide theories. But you anticipated this one, Great Divide under attack. And what happened is that it became known as the literacy myth. And one of the big studies to look at it was saying that, yes, there are important differences between written and oral language, and one of that is the use of decontextualization. So remember we talked about decontextualized versus decontextualized? So if something is contextualized, how much background knowledge do I assume you have? Do I assume you have a lot of background, shared background knowledge, so you fill in the details? Yeah, so it's kind of like when I have conversations with my daughter. Very often I know exactly what she's talking about. Even though she might be talking about a movie that we saw together a month ago, she starts talking about the scene, and because I have enough shared experience with her, I can fill in the rest of the details and follow that. That's highly contextualized. Decontextualized is something that tends to be much more emphasized in print. Being able to communicate. You pick up a textbook, and it assumes that you have a certain level of background knowledge. Very often you pick up a history textbook, and it assumes that you don't have much background in that era, especially if it's an introductory textbook, and that it gives all the relevant information that you need. And it tends not to have much extraneous information. It just talks about the issues in and of themselves. And what some early researchers noticed is that, wow, there's a big difference in the way that language is used, and that these syllogisms really rely heavily on decontextualized thinking. But in oral cultures, so much of it is contextualized, the language use. So it might be not a factor of literacy that causes it, but really the type of thinking that's demanded of them. So there have been a couple of studies, some key studies that have looked at it, and Sylvia Scribner and Michael Cole did some pretty land-breaking work. And they did some work, we'll talk about it in a moment. 1981 is when they published a really important study that we're going to talk about, the Great Divide Under Attack. But then we also have Luria, the Vygotsky student. And he published in the 30s in Russian, but it took a while to get translated to come to Western. But Luria also did some really important work when what they said is maybe it's not literacy that changes the way that people think, but maybe it's industrialization and working in industrial contexts or Western schooling. Maybe that's what fosters the changes of thinking and not print. So Scribner and Cole studied the Vai in Liberia. And the Vai, one of the interesting things about this culture is that they had lots of different villages there. In some villages, most people were literate in Vai. Here are some examples of the Vai syllabary. Most people were literate in that, but it's primarily an oral tradition. And in the Vai culture, there are a lot of people who could be literate in Vai, but have had no formal schooling whatsoever. There are also some villages where there were a lot of people who were schooled in Arabic. And the Arabic training that they had, the Arabic instruction was primarily for religious purposes so that they could read the Quran. There were some people who were biliterate, literate in both Vai and in Arabic. So if literacy has these special cognitive benefits, then you have some people who are biliterate, so they should have this advantage. And then they had some villages where people were formally schooled in English and received traditional Western formal schooling. So that kind of schooling would focus a lot more on decontextualized thinking. And what they did is they gave a wide range of tasks: sorting numbers, sorting pictures, sorting shapes, formal logic problems like the syllogisms, and a variety of language tasks, playing with sounds of language. Anyone want to have any predictions about what they found? Remember, this is Great Divide Under Attack. So what would the Great Divide predict? Yeah, the Great Divide would predict really big differences. So that it would predict that people who are biliterate would have the biggest advantage. And it wouldn't matter what language you're literate in, what the purpose of literacy was for. So when it's for religious purposes, when it's for studying the Quran, when it shares a lot of the similar features for oral culture, then it will be very different than having westernized schooling, where the emphasis would be on this decontextualized thinking. For those who were schooled in Arabic and in the Quran, it was deeper understanding of the context of the culture. And so the Great Divide would predict that it doesn't matter what the purpose is for literacy. It wouldn't matter the schooling experience. The more literacies you have, maybe then the advantage there might be. And here's what they found, that in direct conflict with persistent claims that deep psychological differences divide literate and not literate populations. On no tasks, logical, abstraction, memory, communication, did we find all non-literates performing at lower levels than all literates. Even on tasks closely related to script activities, such as reading or writing with pictures, some non-literates did as well as those with school or literacy experiences. We can and do claim that literacy promotes skills among the Vai, but we cannot and do not claim that literacy is a necessary and sufficient condition for any of the skills asserted. Literate practices among VIA are far more restricted than in technologically sophisticated societies. Cultural heritage is transmitted orally in a way that does not depend upon texts. It does not open doors to vicarious experience, new bodies of knowledge, or new ways of thinking about major life problems. So what they were finding is that when you look at literacy on its own, it's not literacy, it's the kinds of experiences that someone has, the type of schooling experiences. Luria looked at similar issues in Central Soviet Asia, in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. And what they did was they went to these traditional peasant villages in the early 30s, like in 30, 31, 32. And what they did was, again, they gave the syllogisms, they gave a whole bunch of range of tasks to the people there. And they didn't just record whether or not they got them right or got them wrong. They actually had transcripts, they did qualitative analysis of the sorts of things that people said. And what Luria did was he looked at different kinds of people. He looked at those who were living the traditional agrarian peasant lifestyle, farming in the traditional ways. He looked at communities where the peasants were working in the collectives, using more of the mechanization and more of the industrialized tools, which encourages a different kind of thinking than the traditional method, working with different kinds of scheduling, with the collaborative sort of approach. And then he also looked at participants who had formal schooling. And one of the key issues that we're going to look at are the phonologic tasks, like the syllogisms we looked at earlier. And here's a typical answer that you would get from a traditional peasant. All bears are white where there's always snow. In Zovaya Zemlya, there is always snow. What color are the bears there? I've only seen black bears, and I do not talk of what I have seen. What do my words imply? If a person has not been there, he cannot say or anything on the basis of words. If a man was 60 or 80 and had seen a white bear there and told me about it, he could be believed. So this kind of an answer doesn't show that he's incapable of logical thought. It's something that could be known as refusal to do the task. Having to do a task based just on words, just solving it based on a decontextualized, here are the words, here, solve my problem. This is something that was culturally very foreign to the traditional peasants. They listen to the words of experts based on experience. You don't make things up. So they were being asked to do something that was culturally really unfamiliar and really uncomfortable, and they were refusing to do the task. Mm-hmm.
These are the words from the study itself?
Yeah,
so
translation.
They had people that were living to 60 or 80 in the 30s? I know people did, but I mean...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. And yeah. Now, this is an example of is refusing to do the task. I didn't want to kind of inundate you with so many other examples, but other things that people tended to do, the peasants, is that they would tend to import their own premises. So instead of just using the premises in the syllogism, in the Arctic live polar bears. All polar bears are white. Are all bears in the Arctic white? Or all polar bears that live in the Arctic are white. Yes, our polar bears and are white. Thank you. And that's why I have PowerPoints, so that you can always go back to what I've written. What they found is that they would add other things into the premises. So they might say, but here the bears are brown. And what they found is that a lot of the errors that people made were logically accurate, logically acceptable, but using different premises than the ones that they were given. So again, the issue that came up is that those who weren't exposed to Western schooling, instead of being unable to solve the syllogisms, unable to think logically, they were thinking logically. They just weren't treating the task the way that the researchers intended them. And Luria was sensitive enough to notice this. What Luria also found is that those who received westernized schooling, traditional schooling, how do you think they did on syllogisms? Yep, they learned to play the game. They didn't import other ideas into it. They just did the task that they were supposed to do. How about the ones who were working in the collectives? Being exposed to industrialization and having more sort of industrialization and having to organize along more industrialized, decontextualized ways. How do you think they were able to deal with the syllogisms? They did pretty well with them too. So that basically what Luria found was that the non-literate peasants working on the collectives performed more like the literate schooled peasants and less like the non-literate peasants who were farming in traditional methods. So it was the exposure to westernization and industrialization that encouraged this decontextualized thinking, which is something that is valued and part of Western society. So for a while then, it kind of put an end to the Great Divide theory, saying, okay, there's nothing special about literacy then. It's the schooling and the experiences that you have that lead to you to be able to think a particular way. And then there's now more look at, does literacy change the way you think? But it's looking at it in a somewhat different way. It's looking within a Western culture and looking at differences among individuals. And Keith Stanovich and his colleagues are the ones who really look at, does the degree to which kids read, does that have an influence on your intelligence, on your thinking, on your knowledge? So let's start, rather than looking at, does reading make you smarter? What do we think of when someone's smart? They read a lot? Okay, let's try and get away from a circular definition, but without knowing about someone's reading habits. If you heard someone speaking, or you saw someone, what would make you think, oh yeah, that's a smart person?
Usually if they use a lot of big words with a lot of long words that are not usually known.
Yeah, so one of the characteristics of smart people is that they've got pretty broad vocabularies, and they can use the vocabulary well. Not the people who they learn these big words, but they use them inappropriately, and it's like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. But they really do know how to use words well. They're articulate.
Like their drive or like their ambition towards like a specific goal. Like you see how hardworking they are towards their goal.
So a lot of people are driven, and you might actually find some people who are very driven, but you might not necessarily think they're smart, but they're really good at what they do with a particular skill, but you might write off their skill. So what else makes someone smart? Yep. Well, it tends to be the most recent immigrant group that tends to get that label. So yeah, I wouldn't lend it. Okay, what else makes people smart? Yeah.
Like maturity.
So with maturity comes judgment.
The way they deliver when they speak, just the sound, just the way they sound when they are speaking can also determine how you can think they're smart.
Yep, so their command of the language, so their language use, not just the vocabulary, but how they put together their ideas, organize their ideas. Another thing that, do smart people know a lot or a little? Yeah, smart people tend to know an awful lot. They tend to be walking computers, we think of. They also tend to be pretty good at problem solving and reasoning. So if we think of those sorts of things, we want to see, does print exposure, does the amount that you read lead to you getting smarter? Now, one of the things that researchers have looked at is looking more at linguistics. For example, Hayes has looked at what's the vocabulary like in different contexts. In books, we have richer vocabulary than we have in oral language. So one of the ways that kids get exposed to rich language is by reading, that they might not be exposed to by watching television, having conversations with their parents or their peers. And there are some skills that we know are directly related to print. So for example, phonological processing, being able to play with the sounds of language. We know that how you hear the sounds of language is influenced by your reading experience. So for example, if we look even at knowing the letters of the alphabet, if a child is asked how many sounds are in the word B, and they don't know any of the letter names, kids are more likely to say that there are 2 sounds for B, E. What happens when they learn the letters of the alphabet? They might say that there's 1. That's a really common mistake that kids make because, oh yeah, it's B. And they start thinking of the letters. So already you see it shaping them. But then for the words, here are 2 words, ladder and letter. So I want to climb a ladder, and I wrote a letter. The middle sound, are they the same in ladder and letter, or are they different? What do you think a lot of people say? What's the initial reaction? You're too smart. Okay. You're listening too carefully. So for someone who's not knowing that this is a language and literacy class and isn't really paying attention, a lot of people will say that ladder and letter are 2 different sounds because ladder is the D sound and letter is spelled with T, so it has a different sound. When in fact, it really is the same sound. So phonological processing can be influenced by it. Sensitivity to hearing individual sounds. The more literate you are, the more skilled you are at reading, the better you are at hearing the individual sounds and words as well. So you see that with young children, that their phonological awareness, their sensitivity, their ability to play with the sounds, that improves as their reading skill improves, that they go back and forth. Orthographic knowledge refers to spelling patterns, knowing what spelling patterns are legal. And we have FILV, FILK. Which looks more like it could be an English word, the first or the second? Anyone say the first? No, because you're aware with the spelling patterns in English, that there are no words in English that end with the LV. If there's an LV, there'd be an E at the end. But you might not explicitly know that spelling rule or be able to state it, but you're sensitive to the spelling patterns in English about what looks English, what doesn't look like English spelling. And it's not surprising that kids who read more become more aware of the sounds, more skilled with manipulating the sounds, and they also become more sensitive to the spelling patterns. That's not a big surprise. But there are broader skills, such as vocabulary, such as cultural knowledge, such as verbal fluency, being able to generate words and speak easily, and syllogistic reasoning. And the question is, do these skills improve with print exposure? Okay, so let's look at some studies. First, we're going to look at different ways of assessing print exposure. There are a lot of different ways. One is the diary technique. What's diary techniques? How many of you have seen diary techniques used in other fields, developmental fields or cognitive fields? Yeah, so with diary techniques, basically what are you doing? You're asking people to report on a daily basis or on a weekly basis how much they read. It could be how many pages, it could be what they read, it could be how many books, which is similar to the reading logs that kids might have to do at school. How many of you have had to do reading logs at school? Yeah, remember those? And that if you read enough, then you would be able to get like the free pizza, the Book It program. So reading logs is another way that researchers keep track of how much people read. What's one of the problems with reading logs? Uh-huh.
it kind of takes away the intrinsic motivation of reading. Like,
If the reward is really heavily emphasized, yep, it can make someone who's intrinsically motivated become extrinsically motivated. Yep.
And it's also library easily.
Yeah. How many of you have figured out as kids that you can write it down and hope that your parent, and just tell your parents, yes, I really read that. Will you sign it now? I mean, that's part of the reason why parents have to sign reading logs to prevent lying, but reduce that. So one thing that's used in schools are reading management programs. How many of you have seen them, like Accelerated Reader? You read a book, and then you go to the computer and take a quiz on the book. And so the reading management programs, they give you points, and the number of points you get for each book depends on the difficulty of the book, the length of the book, and also how accurate you are on the comprehension test. So those might be a little more sensitive and gets a little more at the quality of the reading you've done. But then Stanovich and his colleagues, they've come up with some really neat, quick and dirty sort of measures. We call them kind of quick and dirty because they're a quick questionnaire that takes a couple of minutes. One is a title recognition questionnaire. You have a whole list of titles of books. Some of them are real books, some of them are made up books. And you tell people, I just want you to check the ones that you know are real books. Don't guess because we can detect guessing. Similar, we can do it with authors. Well, I can't do it with authors because all the foils that he used aren't popular authors, they're reading researchers. And so it's like, I know these names, I know all the names here. And that just messes me up. But for most people, they haven't heard of a lot of the reading researchers. So the author recognition questionnaire, again, people are given a whole list of authors, some of them real, some of them made up, and they're asked just to check the ones they know. They're not told they have to be books that you've read or authors that you've read. You just have to be familiar with the names. There's also the magazine recognition questionnaire. Whole list of magazine titles. And again, just check the ones that you know. The ones that you don't know are real, don't check. We can tell if you're guessing. And here's an example. Oops. Now the logic of this is that, okay, we're not asking you to identify what you've read where there's that social pressure to look good. We're just asking you to identify what you know are real and what isn't real. And the idea is that, well, people who read a lot, like read a lot of magazines, they've seen titles of magazines that they've never read before. Just looking at the list of magazines to get subscriptions for, going to the periodical section at the library, going to the bookstore and checking out all the magazines at the rack. You see a whole bunch of titles that you might not read, but you're familiar with them. Similarly with books. How many of you have read books and seen on the back of books the names of other books that you might like by the same author, same theme? So the idea is that people engage in print more are going to be exposed a lot more to these types of print things. People who don't read, who aren't interested in books, they're not going to spend as much time in bookstores. They're not going to see the bestseller lists. They're not going to see all these other titles as often. So they're not going to be able to recognize as many. And so what Keith Stanovich and Dick West and Ann Cunningham did in their work together is first they validated these questionnaires. They did the reading log methods and the diary methods, and they compared them to these questionnaires. And what they found is that these questionnaires were pretty valid, that they were pretty sensitive and had really high correlations with the reading logs, so that people who read more had higher scores, were more sensitive to titles that actually existed, or more accurate at recognizing real authors. And this is like a 2-minute test. It really doesn't take long to fill out. So what's the advantage of having a quick and dirty little thing like this? It gets rid of some of the self-report bias. So that if you're asking people, how many books did you read in the last month? How often do you read? How much time do you spend reading? Most people like to impress their audience. They either want to lie to make it look like they read more, or they want to lie to make it look like they read less, depending on their audience. But people want to look good. So using a questionnaire like this, it gets rid of some of that bias. There's no perfect measure out there to keep track of how much people read, but what you tend to find is that people who do well on these measures are people who tend to be readers. And other measures also pick up their reading. So before using these new measures, they had to validate these first. So they validated them. Once they validated those measures, then they could actually look at the question, does reading make you smarter? What kind of effects does it have? And they did a whole bunch of different studies. Some of them just with kids in schools and looking at their reading patterns. And then they did one that I just think is such a neat study. It was naturalistic observation. It was an airport study. This was before people had Kindles and readers. But what they did was they would go to, and this was also before tightened security, so you could wander about the waiting areas in the airports and check out what people were doing. You didn't need an airline ticket to be able to get in there. But what they did was they walked around and they saw people who were sitting by themselves. And they would watch them for 10 minutes. Kind of creepy sounding. But they watched them for 10 minutes and they would pay attention to, were they reading the whole 10 minutes or were they not reading the whole 10 minutes? And they approached people who were either consistently reading through the 10 minutes that they were on their own or people who weren't reading, so that it's very clear who the readers are in this study and who the non-readers are. And they gave them a whole bunch of checklists. So they gave them a magazine recognition questionnaire and title recognition questionnaire. And they also gave them TV show sort of recognition questionnaire and movie recognition questionnaire. And they gave them some checklists for vocabulary and for general knowledge, just to get a sense of like their breadth of knowledge. And they kept track of who the readers were and who the non-readers were. And they actually found that the readers and the non-readers, when it came to recognizing titles of movies, titles of TV shows, there was no difference between the readers and no readers. But there were big differences. The readers knew a lot more about print. They recognized more magazines, had fewer false alarms. So you know how you could get all the magazines by checking every single thing there and say even the non-magazines were magazines, but you at least wouldn't miss any of them. They found that they were pretty sensitive to recognizing authors, magazines, and newspapers. So the people who are reading, they also tended to know a lot more about print. So looking to see whether or not they were reading while they were by themselves at the airport and waiting seemed to be a good indication of their reading habits as a whole. But they also found that the readers had broader vocabularies than the non-readers, and they also had more general cultural knowledge, more knowledge about history and cars and just all kinds of bizarre, weird things that's general, not specialized, school-based. The readers tended to be more knowledgeable as a whole. So that's one way that seems to suggest that people who read a lot, it makes you smarter. They also statistically controlled for things like the amount of schooling that people had, their age, because those would be different differences that could have an influence in the knowledge. And even when they statistically controlled for the amount of schooling people had and the age, they still found that the readers outperformed the non-readers. So let's look at another way that they did it. And another way that you could look at it is you could look at people who have high IQs and average IQs. The low IQs weren't in the cognitively impaired range, but they were still in the normal range, but they were at the lower end of the group. Then you also have people with high IQs, people with above average intelligence. The idea is that you would expect people with high IQs to be smarter than people with low IQs, right? That's supposed to be an intelligence quotient. Well, they thought, we know that there are some people who are really smart with high IQs, but they don't read a lot. And we also know that there are some people who might have lower IQs, and, well, they might read an awful lot. So they tested a whole bunch of people and got sort of like the a proxy for an IQ score, nonverbal IQ intelligence, as well as the print exposure. And the people that they included in this particular study, the ones that they used the data for, they included everyone. They had everyone do everything. And one particular analysis was looking at the people who had the low IQs but the high print exposure, and those who had the low IQs and the high print exposure and the low print exposure but the high IQs. So you could really test the theory. How important is print for this? If you're looking at print exposure, if you expect print exposure to be really important, you would expect this group to outperform the high IQ, low print. But if IQ is more important, then you might find that the high IQ group does better than the low IQ group. Nice way to test it out. And what they found is that the kids with the people with a high print exposure, even though they had lower IQs, still in the normal range. We're not talking about cognitively impaired. They had broader vocabularies and greater general knowledge than those with the low print exposure and high IQs. Uh-huh.
But wouldn't low print ability cause them to do worse on the
So their intelligence was based on a nonverbal, nonverbal task, like the Raven's progressive matrices.
Isn't the IQ test verbal?
There are different kinds of IQ, measures for IQ and proxies for intelligence, and they specifically chose to use nonverbal tests, which, because they're thought to reflect, again, aptitude, and they didn't want it confounded with the outcome measures. So they wanted print exposure and then nonverbal IQ as a way of looking at, here's presumed ability, and if you use verbal IQ scales, then general knowledge and vocabulary are subscales in the Wechsler scales and the Stanford. So you would have that major compound there. So that was their way of kind of teasing it apart. Awful lot is Keith Stanovich's 1986 paper on the Matthew effects. And most people, what they know about the Matthew effects is it's from the book of Matthew, and it talks about how everyone who has shall be given, and who has not shall have taken away from them. Another way of saying the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Well, let's take a little look at how that actually happens with reading and literacy with kids. So let's imagine that you've got a kid in kindergarten, first grade, and reading is pretty easy for them. Learning how to read is easy. They pick it up easily. What sort of things do you think they like to do in their free time? They like to read. So what happens when they read more? They get smarter, but they get more practice reading. So reading gets easier for them. And what sort of things do they learn when they're learning to read? They're building their vocabulary. They're building more background knowledge. They're building more fluency in their decoding. They're learning to decode more easily. Their sight vocabulary, the sight word vocabulary, the words that they recognize instantly, that increases. So the more they read, the more skills they develop. That makes reading even easier. So what happens when they get into the next grade? Do they find reading easy or hard? Easy. They might say, oh, this is too easy, if anything. But because they find it easy, reading is something that they enjoy doing. It becomes a hobby of theirs. They like looking things up online, and instead of maybe just looking at video, they like reading the text as well. They like information. They like seeking out information. They like reading magazines. When they have silent reading time in the classroom, how many of you have done that as kids, had that silent reading time? They're actually reading. Now let's look at the kids who struggle when they're initially learning to read. What do you think they like to do in their spare time? Watch TV, play video games. they like to do anything but reading. They'll read if they absolutely have to, if they're forced to. And even then, they might just go through the motions. How many of you have seen kids in sustained silent reading time that are just flipping through the book, looking at the pictures? And they kind of, yeah, so you've seen that happen. So they're not getting any of the practice that they need. And so what happens what do you think happens with their reading skills if they're not practicing? They stay about the same or they improve really slowly. Has any of you taken music lessons as kids? And what happened on weeks that you would practice a lot? It would get easier, and then the weeks that you didn't practice, you might improve a little bit, but really, really slow practice. Now here's a problem in school. The texts keep on getting harder and harder and harder. The vocabulary keeps on getting harder and harder and harder. The background knowledge that's assumed of the kids gets harder and harder and harder. You have less exposure to different text structures. So reading an Agatha Christie book for the first time, a mystery book for the first time, you don't know what's important. You don't know what things you should be paying attention to. What happens after you've read 10 Agatha Christie books? And you're lazy like me. You kind of figure out what to pay attention to. You know that expression, the butler did it? Because it happens in so many books. So you start, oh, there's a butler here. I'm going to start being suspicious over here. So you start looking for key words and key things that really grab your attention because, oh, you know that this is the couple that's going to get together because they hate each other in chapter 1. So, I mean, just through experience in reading a lot, you start getting what the genres are. You start getting what the text structures are. And how do you think that helps your comprehension later on? Does it make it harder or easier if you know what the text structures are? You know what's important to look for. It makes it easier. But if a child's not reading, they're not learning the text structures. They're not learning the vocabulary. They're not learning the keywords. And so what happens is the texts, they keep on getting harder, but their skills aren't improving at the same rate that the difficulty of the texts are increasing. So what do you think happens to them? How do you think their attitudes about reading might change? They start hating it even more. And so the Matthew effect, it really looks at the cycle of how the kids who initially do well, who initially catch on, they enjoy it and they get a lot out of it and they keep on engaging in reading. It's something that's fun for them. And they build the background knowledge and they build the skills. Some of the book series that kids are reading in second grade, third grade, how many of you have read the Magic Treehouse books as kids? And the great thing about those books is it has historical figures in it, it has different inventions, it has different cultures and different times in history, so that the kids, while they're reading for fun, they're learning about the world and different events in history or different inventions. The kids who aren't reading those books, they're not getting the same access to the information. So what we find is that the gap between the kids who initially catch on and the kids who aren't doing well, it grows with time. Yep.
What if we put closed captions on kids' shows?
Well, the nice thing with television is that a lot of televisions now is that you automatically have the closed captions as an option. That can help build the print awareness, and that can be great for them. Educational shows, for example, science, like some of the science shows out there, the kids, it's not saying that they don't have access to the information, they can't learn it, but what it does mean is that their opportunities to learn are more limited, and because the vocabulary and the text structures that they get in print tend to be different from what they'll get orally, they don't have the same chances. Now, the nice thing is with digital books is that there's increasingly the option that you can have the books read to you. So so words that you can't read, you can actually sort of click a button, or some of them, they have the texts that you can see and hear at the same time. and those kids who are struggling readers, that would be a great sort of way. There's software that, the text-to-speech software, some of them you can cut and paste and import into that software so that it can read the text to the kids so they have the same access. Those could be ways to mitigate the problems that they have. I mean, one of the big things that happens is that learning to read, learning to decode and sound things out is really a self-teaching mechanism. So kids who know how to sound out words, what happens when they come to an unfamiliar word and they're reading by themselves? They can sound it out. They're not stuck. They can try and figure it out. And what some of David Scher's research has found is that if they're exposed to a word 6 times and they're successful with the word 6 times, it becomes a sight word, so they don't have to sound it out anymore. And if you're reading a book about a particular topic, you're going to get a bit of vocabulary recycling. You're going to see the same words come up a number of times to build your sight word vocabulary. But what happens with the kids who are struggling readers is that they can't sound out the words very well. Or they might sound out the words wrong and come up with the wrong pronunciation for the words. And they need a lot more exposures to unlearn the mistakes that they've come up with. And what happens with a kid who can't sound out words? What have you seen when they come across a word they don't know? They skip it, or what else do they do? Help! I need help! And that's fine if they're reading with a parent or someone who's reading with them and they supply the words to them because it doesn't interrupt the flow. How many of you have had that experience of you figure out this unfamiliar word and you've forgotten everything that you've read before that because you've put so much effort into that? Especially like with some of your science texts, or I apologize in advance with the textbook for this class, some of the terminology. So the kids who are struggling, they're dependent on help, and if there isn't a helper there, then that can really interfere with their ability to learn. They'll skip words, but the words that they can send out are the sort of small words like the, in, stop, the ones that don't have a lot of meaning, whereas the words that are really rich in meaning and give a lot of the background context information, they can't figure out the words. So some of the technology that's available now can really be helpful for these kids so that they can have access to the content knowledge. We talk about in reading research with reading disabilities, so some of the core characteristics and some of the secondary consequences that happen for reading disabilities. And the core deficits, the core problems they have tends to be with decoding and the phonological processing, playing with the sounds of language. And the secondary problems that develop with time because of the lack of access to print tends to be in vocabulary, it tends to be syntactic, the more complex language skills. And it's not because they have a problem with those skills, it's because they don't have access to the complex language of print because of the reading problems. So it's a secondary problem that develops more as they get older. So the Matthew effect is something that's really important. And what we see now in schools is that there's much heavier emphasis on early intervention for reading problems. There's a program called RTI, Response to Intervention, that many schools across the country are now using in many districts, in which they screen kids in kindergarten, first grades, kids who are having problems. They receive more intensive reading help in kindergarten, in first grade, because they want to prevent the reading problems and stop the negative cycle with Matthew effects. So that's it for today. Have a great weekend.